Hello, everyone, and welcome to Walking Through the Bible. One of the most dangerous pastimes that believers in God can engage in is speaking for God, is looking out at current events and proclaiming what God is doing. Some politician gets elected that we agree with. God must be trying to prosper our nation. Some politician gets elected that we don't agree with. God must be trying to punish our nation for our sins. A natural disaster or major health crisis arise. God must be doing this, or he must be doing that. The problem with that type of thinking is God hasn't told us any of those things. Can God raise up leaders to prosper or punish a nation? Yes, and the scriptures teach that. But to say in the moment that you know which, especially if your conclusion seems to always align with your political persuasion, is downright foolish. And the same thing goes with any of the events in our lives, whether great or small. To illustrate this principle, let's examine Mordecai's attitude towards God's providence in Esther 4 as it concerned the protection of his people, Israel. So if you have a Bible with you, you can turn to the Book of Esther, to Esther chapter 4. We're going to be reading from verses 10 to 17. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, Esther chapter 4, beginning at verse 10. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a command for Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been called, he has but one law: put all to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. So they told Mordecai Esther's words, and Mordecai told them to answer Esther, "Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews who were present in Shushan, and fast for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise. And so I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther commanded him. Haman has by trickery convinced Ahasuerus to exterminate the Jews by telling him that the Jews are lawbreakers. This was false, but falsehoods have never gotten in the way before if someone is truly determined. Mordecai has been showing his grief publicly, and word got back to Esther that such was occurring. She tried to get Mordecai to stop, not understanding the whole situation. Mordecai explained it to the eunuch, who in turn explained it to Esther, and that's where we're going to pick up at verse 10, with Esther's response. She first lays out a truth that cannot be overlooked. It was unlawful for someone to just go before the king unannounced. The penalty for doing such was death, unless the king spared you by extending his golden scepter. Now, of course, it is also true that someone could seek an audience with the king and one be granted, but just to barge in would risk death. That was true even for his wife, who we also learn hadn't been called for 30 days. It was obvious from this that either Ahasuerus has been kept too busy to call for his wife, his love for his wife has subsided, or he is angry with his wife for some reason. But whatever the reason, in Esther's response to Mordecai, Esther is reticent going in to discuss this with the king because of the fact that he hasn't called for her in 30 days, and so something must be wrong. What if he wouldn't see her? What if he said no? What if he cast her out? All of these fears are understandable for a young queen, even though her people are in danger. For Mordecai, though, fear wasn't going to be an acceptable excuse. Esther was in a position to do something, and so she needed to have explained to her the cost of doing nothing. He tells her that she could say nothing out of fear, but don't think that her silence would save her. The edict was absolute. No carve-out for queens, for family of queens, or friends of the king. If you were a Jew, you would be put to death, and Esther would be included in that. Silence, then, didn't equal life. It equaled death. And so if you're going to die anyway, why not die trying to save others rather than dying because you tried to save yourself? That's the essence of what Mordecai tells Esther. But he goes even further than that. He says, who knows whether you have been brought to the kingdom for such a time as this? For a book that doesn't explicitly mention the name of God, this is as close as it gets. Who is the one that can raise kings and queens to accomplish a previously unknown purpose? Only God. Ahasuerus would have no way of knowing that Esther might be needed to save her people. Mordecai would have no way of knowing either, but God could. God knew Haman's heart and knew what Haman was likely to do in a situation when given the chance, and so God could have placed Esther in the position he did in order for her to speak to the king and save her people. God could have done that. But Esther also could have been on the throne merely by time and circumstance, and that time and circumstance could produce some very advantageous outcomes for her people. Who knows? Mordecai didn't, so he wasn't going to say. But what Mordecai did know was that the Jews would be saved. Someone would come to save God's people because God still had a Messiah that would come through the seed of Abraham who would bless all nations. That required the Jews to still be alive, and so Mordecai was confident that the Jews wouldn't die. Would that be a result of Esther or someone else? That was up to Esther and whether she would speak to the king. But God's promises to the Jews about the Messiah were so sure that Mordecai could be confident in the Jews' deliverance. I wish Christians would have the same attitude that Mordecai has today. Someone beats cancer, God saved me. Someone gets a job, God gave me the job. A politician avoids assassination, God did that. Well, what about the righteous people that God doesn't save from cancer? Or the righteous people who don't have good jobs in spite of looking? Or the people who might have been killed instead of the politician who God saved? What of them? You see, the problem that Christians often have when we speak about the providence of God is that it's very me-focused. It's me and not you. Could God have cured me from cancer? Yes. And then I should be using the time that God has granted me in order to accomplish more of his will, for cancer does kill righteous people. But if God doesn't cure me from cancer, that doesn't mean that God doesn't love me, nor does it mean that it was all part of his plan. We live in a sinful world, and death comes to it, even for the righteous. God does have a plan for this world, that all be saved through faith in Jesus Christ. That is God's desire, and that is what I can know. Whether he has a personal plan for me other than my salvation is for God to know. And whether God has a plan for my nation, its leaders, or anything else for that matter is for God to know. I cannot know any of those things, and so I should stop trying to say that I do. If God has a will for those areas, then God knows what that will is, and so I should leave that to him and glorify him as the one who is able to accomplish whatever he chooses. Let's therefore let go of our arrogance in saying that we know that some event happened because it was the Lord who did it. God doesn't speak into our ears, and since that is true, let's humbly do what Mordecai said. Who knows if that happened, because God's will is that it be so. Now, that's not to say that when we are further away from the events and have seen all of the things that have transpired afterwards, that we can't look back with more insight and know a little more certainly that it was the Lord who acted or didn't act. For we know that the Lord does work providentially today. But even then, we should be cautious, for we don't know for sure. But our not knowing, though, doesn't mean we can't glorify God for the things that do happen in our lives, nor does it mean we deny his working in the world that we live in. It just means that we will leave to God the things that are God's and be the faithful, humble servants that he wants us to be, doing my part so that others can come to Christ through the gospel. Getting back to the book of Esther now. Mordecai's words had an effect on Esther. It got her to realize that she couldn't sit back and do nothing. She would have to break the law and speak to the king about her people. Would Esther be justified for doing this? Yes, because the law made by the king was sinful. It was not from God. And since she didn't know when or if the king would call for her again, it was right for her to try and petition the king, even if that risked her life. There was no other choice for Esther, so she had to obey God and seek the salvation of her people, rather than a man's edict to wait and be called before the king. Esther, though, wanted her people to fast for her for 3 days, just as she and her maids would fast as well. And although not explicitly said, I'm sure that this fasting would have been accompanied with prayer to God for his strength, grace, and mercy would be involved too. Again, that is not explicit, but can reasonably be deduced from the text. Esther understood that what she was going to do could result in her death, and the people needed to understand that too. But it was a risk that Esther was willing to take in order to save her people. We'll see how Esther approaches the king to do just that, beginning, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Esther chapter 5, verses 1 to 8, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. We thank you for watching Walking Through the Bible today. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them below. But if you like this video, we ask that you consider subscribing to our channel so you won't miss out on other videos in our series, as well as share this video among your friends so that the saving message of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.